Today is the day that we start reading the novel. Make sure you have your copy of the novel as well as your notebook with you. For many of us, juggling online lessons with face-to-face teaching is a huge challenge. I encourage you to subscribe to the Mrs. M Teaches English YouTube channel, like these videos and share them with your friends and colleagues. It's a small way in which the English department of St. Patrick's CBC can assist other teachers and students to get through their work during this lockdown. I'll be reading from and referring to the Heinemann edition of the novel, the one on the left. Some of you are using other editions. I advise you to keep a bookmark handy so that you can keep your place without worrying too much about the page references. My students have these pages on which they will write their notes about the important characters. They are printed at the end of the lesson plans. I expect my students to paste them into their notebooks and to keep adding to them as we progress through the novel. For the rest of you, make headings with the names of the characters and write your own notes beneath each heading. While we read through Chapter 1, I want you to focus on 3 points. Firstly, the narration of the novel. It is narrated by the main character, a young girl called Scout. As we read, you should think about this choice. How would the novel be different if it were told in the third person, or if an adult narrated the events? Secondly, consider the setting of the novel. You need to make notes on the American South, the small town Alabama, and the deeply entrenched racism that we encounter in this community. Finally, pay attention to the story of Boo Radley. Who is he, and why are the children so captivated by him? One of the challenges of reading To Kill a Mockingbird is the complexity of some of the diction. There will be many words with which you are not familiar. Start a vocabulary section in your notebook. Look out for these words in Chapter 1. Make sure that you know what they mean. Right, let's begin. I shall be reading sections of Chapter 1 to you. Please note that the bits that I skip are not unimportant. You should read them in your own time. Follow in your novels, pausing the video where necessary to annotate the pages and to write notes on the character pages. The novel is cyclical. We begin with the ending. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less, so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintain that the Yule started it all, but Jem, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. And that, of course, is a direct reference to Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech. We lived on the main residential street in town. Atticus, Jem, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. Jem and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, and treated us with courteous detachment. Calpurnia was something else again. She was all angles and bones. She was near-sighted. She squinted. Her hand was wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jem when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jem was born, and I had felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature. He was middle-aged then, and she was 15 years his junior. Jem was the product of their first year of marriage, and 4 years later I was born, and 2 years later our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I didn't miss her, but I think Jem did. He remembered her clearly, and sometimes, in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length and then go off and play by himself behind the car house. And when he was like that, I knew better than to bother him. So in this passage, we have the family. The father, Atticus Finch, the eldest son, Jem Finch, and the daughter, Scout. And they are looked after by their housekeeper, Calpurnia. When I was almost 6 and Jem was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries within calling distance of Calpurnia were Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubos's house 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We were never tempted to break them. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom it was enough to make us behave for days on end. Mrs. Dubose was plain hell. And that was the summer Dill came to us. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jem and I heard something next door in Miss Rachel Haverford's collard patch. We went to the wire fence to see if there was a puppy Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting. Instead, we found someone sitting, looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards. We stared at him until he spoke. "Hey." "Oh, hey yourself," said Jem pleasantly. I'm Charles Baker Harris. I can read. So what? I said. Well, I just thought you'd like to know I can read. You got anything needs reading, I can do it. How old are you? Asked Jem. 4.5? I'm going on 7. Shoot, no wonder then, said Jem. Scout yonder's been reading ever since she was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. Oh, I'm little, but I'm old. Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris? Lord, what a name. Well, it's not any funnier than yours. Aunt Rachel says your name is Jeremy Atticus Finch. Well, I'm big enough to fit mine. Your name is longer than you are. I bet it's a foot longer. Well, folks call me Dill, said Dill, struggling under the fence. We'll do better if you go over it instead of under it, I said. Where'd you come from? Dill was from Meridian, Mississippi, was spending the summer with his aunt, Miss Rachel, and would be spending every summer in Macomb from now on. His family was from Macomb County originally. His mother worked for a photographer in Meridian, had entered his picture in a beautiful child contest and won $5. She gave the money to Dill, who went to the picture show 20 times on it. Well, we don't have any picture shows here except Jesus ones in the courthouse sometimes, said Jim. Ever see anything good? Dill had seen Dracula, a revelation that moved Jem to eye him with the beginning of respect. Tell it to us, he said. Dill was a curiosity. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered above him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken. His laugh was sudden and happy, and he habitually pulled at a cowlick in the centre of his forehead. When Dill reduced Dracula to dust, and Jem said the show sounded better than the book, I asked Dill where his father was. You ain't said anything about him. I haven't got one. Is he dead? No. Well, then if he's not dead, you've got one, haven't you? Dill blushed, and Jem told me to hush, a sure sign that Dill had been studied and found acceptable. Thereafter the summer passed in routine contentment. The Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole on the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate. And there he would stand, his arm around the fat pole, staring and wondering. The Radley place jutted into a sharp curve beyond our house. Walking south, one faced its porch. The sidewalk turned and ran beside the lot. The house was low, was once white, with a deep front porch and green shutters, but had long ago darkened to the colour of the slate-grey yard around it. Rain-rotted shingles drooped over the eaves of the veranda. Oak trees kept the sun away. The remains of a picket drunkenly guarded the front yard, a swept yard that was never swept, where Johnson grass and rabbit tobacco grew in abundance. It's a description of a dilapidated and neglected house. Inside the house lived a malevolent phantom, an evil ghost. People said he existed, but Jem and I had never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped in windows. When people's azaleas froze in a cold snap, it was because he had breathed on them. Any stealthy small crimes committed in Macomb were his work. Page 15. The misery of that house began many years before Jem and I were born. The Radleys, welcome anywhere in town, kept to themselves a predilection unforgivable in Maycomb. They didn't go to church, Macomb's principal recreation, but worshipped at home. Mrs. Radley seldom, if ever, crossed the street for a mid-morning coffee break with her neighbours, and certainly never joined a missionary circle, which would be similar to our Bible studies. Mr. Radley walked to town at 11:30 every morning and came back promptly at 12, sometimes carrying a brown paper bag that the neighbourhood assumed contained the family groceries. I never knew how old Mr. Radley made his living. Jem said he bought cotton, a polite term for doing nothing. But Mr. Radley and his wife had lived there with their 2 sons as long as anybody could remember. Skip a paragraph. According to neighbourhood legend, when the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum, an enormous and confusing tribe domiciled in the northern part of the county, and they formed the nearest thing to a gang ever seen in Maycomb. They did little, but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 pulpits. They hung around the barber shop, they rode the bus to Abbotsville on Sundays and went to the picture show. They attended dances at the county's riverside gambling hill, the Dewdrop Inn and Fishing Camp, and they experimented with stump-hole whiskey. Well, nobody in Maycomb had nerve enough to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was in with the wrong crowd. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver, a vehicle, resisted arrest by Macomb's ancient beadle, Mr. Connor, and locked him in the courthouse outhouse, the outside toilet. The town decided something had to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined that they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the probate judge on charges of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, assault and battery, and using abusive and profane language in the presence and hearing of a female. The judge asked Mr. Connor why he included the last charge. Mr. Connor said they cussed so loud he was sure every lady in Maycomb heard them. The judge decided to send the boys to the State Industrial School, where boys were sometimes sent for no other reason than to provide them with food and decent shelter. It was no prison, and it was no disgrace. Mr. Radley thought it was. If the judge released Arthur, Mr. Radley would see to it that Arthur gave no further trouble. And knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. The other boys attended the industrial school and received the best secondary education to be had in the state. One of them eventually worked his way through engineering school at Auburn. The doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays as well as Sundays, and Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years. How's that for a punishment? A curfew of 15 years. But there came a day, barely within Jem's memory, when Boo Radley was heard from and was seen by several people, but not by Jem. He said Atticus, their father, never talked much about the Radleys. When Jem would question him, Atticus's only answer was for him to mind his own business and let the Radleys mind theirs. They had a right to. But when it happened, Jem said Atticus shook his head and said, So Jem received most of his information from Miss Stephanie Crawford, a neighbourhood scold, who said she knew the whole thing. We've all got a Miss Stephanie in our neighbourhoods, don't we? That gossip. According to Miss Stephanie, Boo was sitting in the living room cutting some items from the Maycomb Tribune, the local newspaper, to paste in his scrapbook. His father entered the room. As Mr. Radley passed by, Boo drove the scissors into his parents' leg, pulled them out, wiped them on his pants, and resumed his activities. Mrs. Radley ran screaming into the street that Arthur was killing them all. But when the sheriff arrived, he found Boo still sitting in the living room cutting up the Tribune. He was 33 years old then. I'm not sure about you, but I might have got a tad frustrated if I had been housebound for 15 years. Skip a paragraph. Nobody knew what form of intimidation Mr. Radley employed to keep Boo out of sight. But Jem figured that Mr. Radley kept him chained to the bed most of the time. Atticus said no, it wasn't that sort of thing, that there were other ways of making people into ghosts. That's a significant quote. I'd highlight that if I were you. My memory came alive to see Mrs. Radley occasionally open the front door, walk to the edge of the porch and pour water on her cannas, a type of flower. But every day Jem and I would see Mr. Radley walking to and from town. He was a thin, leathery man with colourless eyes, so colourless they did not reflect light. His cheekbones were sharp and his mouth was wide, with a thin upper lip and a full lower lip. Miss Stephanie Crawford said he was so upright. He took the word of God as his only law, and we believed her because Mr. Radley's posture was ramrod straight. He never spoke to us. When he passed, we would look at the ground and say, "Good morning, sir," and he would cough in reply. Mr. Radley's eldest son lived in Pensacola. He came home at Christmas, and he was one of the few persons we ever saw enter or leave the place. From the day Mr. Radley took Arthur home, people said the house died. But there came a day when Atticus told us that he would wear us out if we made any noise in the yard, and commissioned Calpurnia to serve in his absence if she heard a sound out of us. Mr. Radley was dying. He took his time about it. Wooden sawhorses blocked the road at each end of the Radley lot. Straw was put down on the sidewalk. Traffic was diverted to the back street. Dr. Reynolds parked his car in front of our house and walked to the Radleys every time he called. Jem and I crept around the yard for days. At last the sawhorses were taken away, and we stood watching from the front porch when Mr. Radley made his final journey past our house. "There goes the meanest man ever God blew breath into," murmured Calpurnia, and she spat meditatively into the yard. We looked at her in surprise, for Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of white people. The neighborhood thought when Mr. Radley went under, Boo would come out, but it had another think coming. Boo's elder brother returned from Pensacola and took Mr. Radley's place. Skip 4 lines. The more we told Dill about the Radleys, the more he wanted to know, and the longer he would stand hugging the light pole on the corner, and the more he would wonder. I wonder what he does in there. It looks like he's just stuck his head out the door. Or he goes out all right when it's pitch dark. Miss Stephanie Crawford said she woke up in the middle of the night one time and saw him looking straight through the window at her. Said his head was like a skull looking at her. Ain't you ever waked up at night and heard him, Dill? He walks like this. Why do you think Miss Rachel locks up so tight at night? I've seen his tracks in our backyard many a morning, and one night I heard him scratching on the back screen, but he was gone time Atticus got there. "Oh, I wonder what he looks like," said Dill. Jem gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. That's why his hands were blood-stained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped and he drooled most of the time. "Let's try to make him come out," said Dill. "I'd like to see what he looks like." Jem said if Dill wanted to get himself killed, well, then all he had to do was go up and knock on the front door. Our first raid came to pass only because Dill bet Jem the grey ghost against 2 Tom Swifts that Jem wouldn't get any further than the Radley gate. In all his life, Jem had never declined a dare. The reference to the grey ghost and the 2 Tom Swifts are books. So they're going to swap books for this dare. Jem thought about it for 3 days. I suppose he loved honour more than his head, for Dill wore him down easily. "You scared?" "Ain't scared, just respectful." "You're too scared even to put your big toe in the front yard." Jem said he reckoned he wasn't. He'd pass the Radley place every school day of his life. "Always running," I said. But Dill got him the 3rd day, when he told Jem that folks in Meridian certainly weren't as afraid as the folks in Maycomb, that he'd never seen such scary folks as the ones in Maycomb. And this was enough to make Jem march to the corner, where he stopped and leaned against the light pole, watching the gate hanging crazily on its homemade hinge. "I hope you've got it through your head that he'll kill us each and every one, Dill Harris. Don't blame me when he gouges your eyes out. You started it, remember." "Oh, you're still scared." Jem wanted Dill to know once and for all that he wasn't scared of anything. "It's just that I can't think of a way to make him come out without him getting us. And besides, Jem had his little sister to think of." When he said that, I knew he was afraid. Near the bottom of page 20. Jem stood in thought so long that Dill made a mild concession. "I won't say you ran out on a dare, and I'll swap you the grey ghost if you just go up and touch the house." "Touch the house? That all?" Dill nodded. "Sure that's all now? I don't want you hollering something different the minute I get back." "Yeah, that's all. He'll probably come out after you when he sees you in the yard, and then Scout and me'll jump on him and hold him down till we can tell him we ain't going to hurt him." We left the corner, crossed the side street that ran in front of the Radley house, and stopped at the gate. "Well, go on. Scout and me's right behind you." "I'm going. Don't hurry me." He walked to the corner of the lot, then back again, studying the simple terrain as if deciding how best to effect an entry, frowning and scratching his head. And then I sneered at him. Jem threw open the gate and sped to the side of the house, slapped it with his palm and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. Safely on our porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The old house was the same, droopy and sick. But as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter move, flick, a tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. Did you take notes as I read to you? How does Scout relate to the characters around her? What effect does it have to see the world through the eyes of a child? Are you familiar with the term Bildungsroman? A Bildungsroman is a novel about the moral and psychological growth of a character. In To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout undergoes a journey of self-discovery. As she comes to terms with the adult world around her, she has to reassess the ideals and norms of her childhood. And although the journey is metaphorical, there is a literal journey that Scout will undertake at the end of the novel. And this journey culminates with the breaking of Jem's arm, which is referred to in the opening lines of chapter 1. The setting is very important as it gives us a clue as to why the characters act and react in the way that they do. In this racially divided town, you'll find a microcosm of the larger society. Kind people, just people, wicked people, prejudiced people. Maycomb is really everywhere. You'll find elements of your own surroundings in this setting. These maps of Maycomb are not definitive. They are, however, useful in trying to understand what happened where. Remember, it was a different time. Your boundaries extended as far as you could walk, and not much further than that. Boo Radley is the most intriguing of characters. Who is he? Why does he stay inside the house? The children have made up incredible stories to account for his seclusion. You will find that their stories are fantastical, and they don't take into account the tragedy of Boo's life. Now that we have been through chapter 1, you need to answer these questions. My students, please paste the questions into your notebook and answer them yourselves. When you're done, send me an email and I'll send you the model answers. Remember to P your answers. Give well-substantiated reasons with quotes from the text itself. Write in as much detail as you can. And when you're done, let me know. Seriously, guys, do the work first and then ask me for the answers. If you have any difficulties at all, let me know. I look forward to your company when we start chapter 2.